Hello, I'm Carol Pineau. Welcome to Africa Today TV special series, Africa and the Trump administration. 26%. That's the amount the average American believes is spent on foreign assistance from the U.S. budget. The reality? A mere 1%. And of GDP, it's a fraction of that. President Trump's supporters criticize foreign aid, saying it goes to countries that are against the U.S., and that the U.S. has its own problems: poverty, unemployment, crumbling infrastructure. Spending big on foreign assistance, they argue, is inconsistent with putting America first. Meanwhile, in Africa, with many countries the beneficiaries of foreign assistance, a debate has raged for more than a decade. Is aid even helpful? Has it really lifted people out of poverty? Or has it crippled so much of Africa, destroying local economies, encouraging corruption, and creating dependency among the people? Here to discuss the issue today is Franklin Moore, Chief of Programs at AfriCare and a former Deputy Assistant Administrator for Africa at USAID. Joshua Maserve, Senior Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation, and Landry Signet, Public Policy Fellow at the Wilson Center and a Professor and Distinguished Fellow at Stanford University Center for African Studies. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. You know, Landry, there certainly have been a lot of critics of aid, particularly coming out of Africa now, asking whether this has been helpful, while others say that it's very much needed. Where do you stand on this?
We have both stories of successes and failure, and what matters rather is not if aid should be administered or no, but what a given country really needs, what the citizens really need, and how and what could be done to achieve these goals. I believe foreign aid can lift a country from poverty to at least middle-level income, and why not developed one. We also have less successful countries funded by foreign aid, which could make a country becoming aid dependent.
You are from Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank. What are you advising people as far as the efficacy of aid? As far as this debate in Africa, should there be aid or shouldn't there be aid?
As far as long-term development aid is concerned, I think it's very fair to ask questions about how effective has it been. And the numbers are very concerning. They talk about U.S. investment alone in Africa, for instance. No one knows quite what it has been, but it might be in the trillions. And you look at poverty levels, things of that nature, they haven't budged much. Now, we've had success in public health, so very successful interventions there, so that's a clear sort of win for aid. But we should be asking about whether in other areas where it has not produced results, whether it's worth continuing, whether it needs to be reformed, whether it needs to be restructured somehow, and whether there have been some counterproductive effects of what we've done. My hope is that the cuts, if indeed there are cuts, which we think there will be, that they will be the results of a thorough review process that is in-depth and fair and holistic, and that drives the cuts. I'm a little nervous about saying, well, we're going to cut this percentage off no matter what, because that's somewhat of an arbitrary target.
And definitely one of the primary issues on this is country ownership of the programs. And this is where, if I can give a plug for Africa, I'm sure you don't mind, but you all have really done well in this. I think that when you come in, it's a very different kind of thing than a lot of these agencies. Yeah. And my concern about a lot of these, they're implementers for USAID, but they don't have the government oversight that USAID would have.
We were an organization that was created by a combination of Americans and Africans from the very first day. The vast majority of AfriCare's staff, probably 90% when you take the whole staff, is African. And we feel that they represent their communities and also have buy-in from their communities. As we've looked at aid historically, the role of good governance in aid was not important until we got to the 90s. And whether they were countries who supported us or didn't support us, we generally viewed in terms of global settings. Did they vote with us in the UN, for example? And so what took place internally sometimes was not considered as important as what we got out of it.
What about the expression that countries don't have friends, they just have interests?
There's some truth to that.
Long-term foreign assistance certainly has its critics, but the same is not necessarily true of humanitarian aid, much-needed emergency assistance that pours in after natural and man-made disasters. Earthquakes, typhoons, hurricanes, tsunamis, or widespread Ebola outbreaks. Few nations on Earth can deal with such overwhelming disasters. In these cases, even wealthy nations need some help from their friends. But then there are the more nuanced issues, like wars or even famines. Drought may cause severe food shortages, but rarely is a true famine not accompanied by political turmoil and economic mismanagement. Man-made or not, these disasters can cause massive suffering, and rarely are the perpetrators among the victims. The ownership of these agencies, the UN, the World Bank, makes it impossible for them to even say aid is not getting to the people because the government is taking it, because they're owned by the governments. They can't come out and really say that.
I think transparency makes a lot more people know that. And I think transparency helps those who are part of the World Food Program or some other UN agency to also be pushed into a situation where they actually are telling what is going on the ground. And they are beginning to say food is not getting where it needs to go for the following reasons. And of course, we also have been able to highlight a number of cases where governments may have felt they were going to take advantage of this situation. The classic one being Southern Sudan, where they said, if you want to send an aid worker in here, it's going to cost you $20,000. And their neighbors and the world put pressure on them, and that disappeared within a few days.
Just briefly, and to briefly come to the question of transparency, I think it's not just related to the relation between international and national actors. It's also related to the domestic processes.
On the ground, yeah.
Absolutely, and it's where things start. So if local leaders are not accountable, are not transparent, are not committed to the public good for their citizens, then processes are more complex than in cases where we have institutions, whether in democratic or less democratic countries, but where leaders are more accountable.
It's so difficult when you see these images. They're heart-wrenching, and you want to do something, and yet then you see things like the government of Sudan pulling something like that, or that these are always in areas where it's from bad governance, bad economic management. What happens then as far as selling the idea of aid to the American public?
Sort of the first ethic, I think, of emergency aid should be do no harm. And very frequently, it is a crisis, it's an emergency, so everyone rushes. And you can have all sorts of negative consequences to rushing into an environment, particularly a conflict one, where armed groups might seize. This is happening in South Sudan constantly. The WFP warehouses have been looted. They're shaking down and extorting aid organizations. And you have to ask yourself, is the presence of some aid organizations actually indirectly fueling this conflict? Because armed groups are deriving succor, they're deriving food and money. Same situation in Somalia, of course. Al-Shabaab has, during the last go-around with a famine in Somalia, Al-Shabaab was charging massive, exorbitant fees to any aid organization that wanted to enter their territory. And aid organizations paid. They paid tens of thousands of dollars to an organization that kills more Somalis than anyone else, under whose control 250,000 people died during that famine. That's the best guess, there are extra deaths on top of what the normal death rate would be. So I think sometimes aid organizations have to be a bit more careful, a bit more strategic, and really have this ethical debate with themselves about, is our presence going to actually fuel a conflict? And it's really hard because you do have these images. There are absolutely people starving. Yeah. It's a horrific decision, but I think people need to grapple with it.
Right, like what kind of person would support giving food to them, but at the same time,
Yeah.
you're not actually helping in the end, possibly.
Right, absolutely. And the other issue is sometimes that, and again, we had this experience in Somalia in the 90s where aid organizations came in, dumped a bunch of food, and destroyed the merchant class, essentially. You see it with clothing as well, like free clothing gets dumped onto markets, and then the local class involved in creating clothing, weaving, whatever it is gone.
In fact, a couple of countries have now banned used clothing.
Yes,
right?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Frankly, if the local governance isn't good and the aid is going to be squandered, is it still worth it?
That's a hard question to answer. I do think there are some situations where it is certainly worth trying. I do think that some of the new methodologies for delivering humanitarian aid may be more successful. There is a lot of aid that is delivered by way of voucher these days, as opposed to actually delivering the food. It first gets around that problem of destroying the merchant class and the work of markets, but it also allows the individuals a little more dignity, and it allows them a whole lot more choice. And when that occurs, there's not a stockpile of food to be taken by rebels, et cetera, et cetera.
The U.S. is considered a donor nation, while most African countries are referred to as recipients. The term implies a donor with altruistic motives, offering to give while expecting little in return. Nothing could be further from the truth. The U.S. receives numerous benefits from foreign assistance. The aid business is just that, a business that supports thousands of U.S. jobs. American foreign assistance often requires firms to use U.S. airlines whenever possible. Donated goods must be transported on U.S. ships, and U.S. food aid must be purchased and processed by American firms. And yes, the U.S. pays more to the United Nations and World Bank than others, but that guarantees a larger influence. Certainly, the U.S. benefits from foreign assistance, and drastic cuts will mean a loss of jobs and revenue for U.S. companies and reduced influence around the world. But there is another side, and one that benefits all parties. Done well, international aid and development greatly contributes towards peace and prosperity. As Secretary of Defense, General Jim Mattis says, if you don't fully fund the State Department, then I need more ammunition. Those are pretty harsh words.
I think that for the United States, there are two clear things that are benefits above and beyond those that you talked about, and the general gets at one of them. One is that it helps societies in ways that minimize insecurity and minimize the reasons people might want to join a militia or Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram or some other organization like that. The other thing that it does is that the partnership, in the case of Africa, is creating millions of middle-class consumers. And the creation of consumers anywhere is an advantage to the United States because the United States produces as well or better than most countries in the world those goods that middle-class consumers want. So it creates trade opportunities for us.
So these same issues are exactly what you were talking about in the beginning, that aid really develops as far as health, education, those aspects, and that we would pay a price if it wasn't happening.
Yes, but I even want to add, we have 4 key drivers of the United States foreign policy: peace, power, prosperity, principles.
I like that, the 4 Ps.
Absolutely. So people will think that foreign assistance, foreign aid is just related to principles. No. It also helps the United States in developing his economic influence, so prosperity. It also helps of increasing its power, the soft power. So those aspects are important. I will also add that based on a study by Power Africa, which is a program which was recently funded, about 1,500 jobs were created in the United States for not far from 150, more than $150 million. But more importantly, they anticipate by 2030 to create about 40,000 jobs in the United States and generate $1 billion in revenue exclusively in the power sector. So those are concrete economic gain by the United States. So it's not just an altruistic action.
When you're talking to people within the administration, within these circles, how can they make the justification? Because so much would actually harm us back in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Well, as far as the economic benefits to the United States of aid, there are certainly much more efficient ways to derive economic benefit than the aid program.
That's actually a good point.
It's a very tangential sort of economic benefit. And again, if we were strictly going by that metric, there would be a very bad way to go about deriving economic benefit. And also, as far as stability, peace, and prosperity, the record's very mixed. Like there isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that long-term development aid has significantly contributed to peace and prosperity and stability in these areas. Now, there certainly have been successful programs. There's no doubt about that. But looking overall, because there's also counterexamples, like countries where we have spent a lot of money and are still deeply violent and unstable. So, but there is no doubt that our aid program is built partially on our interests. It gives us a certain amount of influence in countries that is useful to the United States. And to me, that's one of the reasons to do it, actually, is that it gives us a say in issues about which we care. Now, there's other countries where it's a real stretch to say that we're doing it for any sort of profound national interest.
Yes, but we should also mention the fact that the largest recipient of foreign aid in Africa broadly, including countries such as Egypt, Nigeria, are not necessarily the poorest one. And they are also countries with a high potential, economic potential, or strategic interest.
You know, we forget sometimes, though, there were many, many years when the World Bank and others refused to ever utter the C word, corruption. And, nobody wanted to be the one to lose that country for those res reps. So definitely, there's a real difference now.
I'm not sure if I looked at our investments in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I would start counting at the beginning. I would probably start counting sometime after Mobutu, because I think for us, for the French, and for some others, foreign assistance was intentionally a payoff to a small cadre of people, so that we either had access to some raw materials, we had support militarily, and support in votes. So for me, when you look at how much we have invested in any one country, there are periods when the rules for that investment were very different than they are today.
Let's take some questions from our viewers. Joseph in Arlington, Virginia writes, I see a lot of poverty in America, and we read a lot about corruption in Africa. Why should we send any money over there when it's needed here? So Josh, if I can have you take that.
Yeah, this is a common sort of critique that you hear, and I understand the sentiment behind it, but I hope we've gotten a little bit in this discussion to some of the benefits that the United States does derive from humanitarian aid. To be very clear-eyed about it, we don't do it just because we want to help other people. That is part of it, but there is absolutely a part of it that helps the United States, where, again, we have a certain influence with countries. It keeps other countries that are not so friendly to our own interests out.
Or are rather economically competitive with us, like China?
Well, I wasn't going to say another C word, China, but okay, we'll say China. Yeah, but the reality is, I think there's plenty of area for cooperation with China, but there's also a lot of competition. And If we cede certain ground to the Chinese, the Russians are very active in Africa, very strategically so, I would argue, as a form of leverage, what we're talking about right now. So that's another reason that we need to be engaged. Again, we need to do it smartly. It's worth checking these programs. It's worth reforming where reform is needed. But there is, I do believe it is in American interests that there is a payoff here for the United States.
Elijah comments on Facebook, why do Africans think the U.S. will help them develop? Name me one country that developed in Africa because of the U.S.'s help.
I believe that we have both successes and failures. For example, Botswana. Botswana has received in the 80s up to, for a given year, up to $200 per capita in terms of foreign aid. And I think at the time it was probably one of the largest recipients. Of course, aid is not what explains everything about the success of Botswana. We also have accountable governance, absolutely, natural resources which were better managed.
They also had good governance.
Yes.
And good governance allowed them to help to make decisions about that aid, channel that aid, and as their own resources came on board, keep their own resources from being captured by some portion of the population.
Teddy in East Africa notes, aid has been so destructive for us as Africans. It feeds the narrative that Africans are helpless. We should understand the cost to all of us in Africa.
To me, the only way that Africa will move beyond the stereotype we're talking about and the reality of poverty is through free enterprise, through jobs. China is the best example of this. Hundreds of millions of people have come out of poverty in China over the last 2 or 3 decades, and it's not because of humanitarian development aid.
Africa has been very good in the kinds of advertisement that you do. Everyone has to get donors, but you don't show that kind of starving African, the stereotype, if you will, development porn, as some people call it, poverty porn. Doesn't that have an effect? And I think that's really what the viewer is saying.
We believe it does have a cost. We just think that it's more important to show the picture of the healthy child. We think that's better because that child is the child that can go into the economy, get a job, work, etc. And we think it's more important to show that child than the child who is not getting those services.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you so much to my guests, Franklin Moore, Landry Signier, and Joshua Muserve.